question for you. If Jesus were on your debate team, would Jesus pwn all the news?
Yes,
Who said yes?
I did.
And I think I want to start with that question because there are two historical schools of thought in debate, reaching back actually before Jesus' time to the father of your discipline today. Does anyone know who that is? Who kind of started the discipline of debate that you're part of?
Aristotle.
Aristotle. How did Aristotle start it?
He encouraged people to ask questions about everything.
You're close. So Aristotle actually wrote a really famous book. Does anyone know the name of the book that influences what you do today? Anybody know who Aristotle is? Tell us a few more facts about Aristotle. He wrote the Nicomachean Ethics. That's one of his famous books. And in that, we get the concept of the golden mean, that it is good for someone to learn to have moderation in their life and manage their repetitive appetite. So courage is golden mean, being so brave that you actually risk everybody's lives. Recklessness is excess, and cowardice is deficiency, and on through the virtues. That's the ethics. Very good. He wrote actually piles and piles and piles of books, from botany to grammar to ethics to politics. Who did he study under? Plato. Aristotle was Plato's student. We're actually talking about the foundation of Western society and Western civilization here. Because who did Aristotle train? Socrates trained Plato, Plato trained Aristotle. Close. It was. Alexander the Great, the conqueror and creator of Western society. Now, it's not like he was Aristotle's pupil in a Aristotle chose him sort of way. It was more like Aristotle runs this really great school because he has a heritage of Socrates and Plato, and Alexander the Great's rich parents forced Aristotle to teach him by sending Alexander. So Aristotle didn't really claim the success of Alexander the Great as his own because Aristotle would morally disagree with a whole pile of what Alexander the Great did. Aristotle wrote the book called Rhetoric, the first foundation of what you have today as an art of debate comes from his book, Rhetoric. And in Rhetoric, he says that debate, which is one of the three types of discourse, deliberative, judicial, and ceremonial, epidictic oratory. You do that sometimes in speech, but like funerals and eulogies and toasts are ceremonial. So you got judicial and deliberative rhetoric. Judicial rhetoric is what all of the books up to that point have focused on. That's where you have lawyers and judges, and you're looking at courtrooms. And Aristotle says there's a huge problem with all the rhetoric study that's done to date, which is that when you're in the courtroom, whose interests do you represent?
Either your clients if you're the defense, or the government if you're the prosecutor.
Good. So you represent your side. And all the rhetoric books up to that point in time had spoken from that perspective. But Aristotle says when you're actually in political discourse, when you're in any sort of informational meeting where you're trying to get other people to act, he calls it deliberation. Any sort of conversation that you have, your interests aren't aligned there. And you will proceed selfishly as a communicator, and you will lose your audience if you follow the path of judicial rhetoric, which is why I don't think you should all aim to become lawyers and model lawyer style in debate. That's someone who's paid to support their side, and their interests are that they win. But I think oftentimes as debaters we appear that way. Aristotle says in deliberative oratory, whose interests matter most? Probably. You can figure this out.
The person in whose honor you're giving the...
You're close. In whose honor might we say you're giving a discourse when you are deliberating? He wouldn't say that. You're right. No. It's the audience. Aristotle says that the great rhetoricians, when it comes to deliberation, are self-sacrificial. In order to be an effective communicator, you set your own interests aside and begin by understanding your audience. And you're always arguing on behalf of your audience. And you never say such things that lead your audience to make a poor decision. You never hawk bad wares to your audience because you're in moral jeopardy there. You never sell them a case that you secretly came up with last week and hid from everyone so that you could convince and con an audience into adopting something that they should never adopt if it were properly tested and thoroughly understood. That's Aristotelian rhetoric. That's one side of rhetoric for 2,500 years. There's another side, an enemy school of thought. So this comes out of Plato, Platonic thought, but Aristotelian rhetoric is where most of you, I think, whether you know it or not, would naturally find yourselves in. But there's a enemy school. Does anybody know which school of thought that is? Testing all your history a little bit. Really? If I sat in a chair, would it be less scary? Eventually I'm going to stand up there, so it can be twice as scary, but I'm not really scary. I have a 7-year-old daughter. And a dog. The Sophists. Has anybody ever heard of the Sophists? You ever heard of the word sophistry? What's sophistry? What's sophistry? Purple.
It was, I read about this, but it was in response to it, it was all about the personal gain, wasn't it?
Yes. Very good. You survived. The school of the Sophists. So Plato's school and the school of the Sophists were in the same town, and you can send your kids to either one of these schools. And the school of sophistry prides itself in being able to be persuasive even if you don't agree with what you're saying. Now that's a sort of negative way to say this, but that is actually the right way to say this. And if you look throughout history, we've actually used that word in very negative ways. From sophomore, which means the person who treats freshmen like garbage but doesn't actually know anything, to sophomoric, the person who obnoxiously defends their point of view without, anytime anybody else says something. They don't want to listen. Sophistry is the idea that you're going to sell something that you yourself wouldn't purchase, as it were. That's sophistry. And those two schools have been at war for millennia. And when you participate in debate, you have that choice every day. Are you going to be light side or dark side? Really? Because some of the worst things that ever happened in history happen because people choose the dark side of rhetoric. Yes?
As the types of debate we're doing, we do not need to choose just one side of the debate. So in some cases, we do have to debate. Like, we don't take moral debates, but you do have to choose a side. And so in some cases, you couldn't believe one is right, one is wrong. So for whatever the only it has to do with private property.
Right.
So
I actually, this is interesting. So it's a great little aside. I came to the Patrick Henry College debate team, and as a freshman, I was flabbergasted. Our first tournament was on the topic, separation of church and state is being inappropriately eroded. Which, coming from a conservative Christian school, you would think we'd probably have a really interesting position. You know what the PhD debate team was doing at the time? They were analyzing what did the judging pool, who are liberal colleges, what do they think in selling them cases that supported what those judges already think. That's sophistry. And so when we as little freshmen said, hey, we're going to run and value the American philosophy of government and actual supernatural morality in a secular environment, our coaches, who you actually know, said, don't do it. And they tried to get us to not run that case. They said it can't be done. You can't win with conservative ideas in a liberal setting. And stubborn us did anyway. And we went 6-0, won the tournament, got first and second place speaker. Because you can learn how to sell what you really believe, even in environments where you wouldn't expect them to buy it. Now that doesn't really answer your question. In policy, it's easier. In policy, it's don't run a plan you don't believe in. That's pretty easy, right? Because that's a subset of the resolution. You should change your agriculture policy. Look, you don't believe that GMOs are actually harmful, then don't run a case to ban GMOs just because you know that imami judges are going to already be inclined to that perspective. That's sophistry. And you're trying to discipline yourself to learn how to overcome persuasive challenges. And you learn nothing of value. I mean, you learn something, but you don't learn as much of value from debate. You take a good approach anyway. Now let's take the value topic. Because I think that you never, ever, ever, from Parley, I've debated at Parley Nationals, round 1, prostitution should be legalized. Whoa, not really expecting to have that debate. All the way down to the value resolution right now, needs of the public versus private property rights. I don't think you ever have to take a position that you morally disagree with. I think you can creatively get around it. So for example, needs of the public, private property. If you in general agree that private property rights are more important than the needs of the public, can you find a specific instance in which you don't? I can think of a few. Common defense, the ability to have military bases. Ebola breaks out. Anthrax attacks, they search your mail. And so I think what we call that in debate, we actually call that parameterization, which is where you narrow your position. You narrow your claims to claims that you believe, instead of trying to prove the entirety of the position. You do not have to prove that in all cases needs of the public outweigh private property rights, if you don't believe that. But you can prove it in some cases, and I think that the research can get you to the heart of it. So I used to use an interview question for Patrick Henry debate scholarships. If you were asked in a Parley motion and the resolution was, this house would legalize abortion, or this house would perform abortion, something like that, what would you do? And I got even thirds of answers. I would do the best I can. I would forfeit the round. And then the correct answer. I would redefine abortion as stopping something. Abortion has many different definitions. Yes, culturally, the most important one right now to us is the Roe v. Wade kind. But I'm going to propose some other thing. We're just going to abort our policy in ISIS. We're going to abort our, you name it. And then you know what battle they've chosen as a debater? Because you always choose a battle when you choose a strategy. What battle did they choose? What's the round going to be about? What? Topicality. You walk into that round saying either they debate my case or they debate topicality. So you spend the bulk of your prep time prepping 14 standards that your interpretation meets, including not putting you in a morally compromising position. And that's how a Parley debater would approach it. And I think I've never seen a case where even with a value resolution, you can't find a part of the resolution that you agree with on both sides and just articulate that part. Does that help with your question? You're so skeptical?
No, I understand the perspective.
If you'd like to go deeper, I'm very happy to. You can challenge me, guys. Rules of engagement. We're debaters. So sometimes we learn by conflict. Iron sharpens iron. You can press much deeper, like a specific thing that you disagree with. I'll get you off the spot for now, but you can chase me down. I have been in business. What you didn't hear is so by day I'm actually in business and technology and consulting, and one of my recent jobs was going around the country for about 4 years briefing CEOs and executive teams on what their employees thought. So I represented their employees, sometimes 4,000, sometimes 40, to executive teams and told executive teams what their employees really thought about them. I have been cursed out of boardroom meetings. You guys can't scare me. Okay, we can learn a lot today, but definitely get involved. All right, back to the lesson. Aristotle. So, what Aristotle advocates in the rhetoric is something that you would put the audience on kind of a pedestal and say, in a good form of rhetoric, we move our audiences towards the good. And that's what classical rhetoric has actually adopted as a catchphrase for over 2,500 years. Move audiences towards good. In making that commitment as a communicator, I think is a lifelong commitment. that everybody should make. And you have that chance. Every time you're in a sales meeting and you want to pitch your product, and you know that there's a flaw in it, do you gloss over the flaw, or do you mention the flaw and allow that person to make up their own decision? Do they want to buy your product with the flaw or not? That's an everyday conflict between light side and dark side rhetoric. And if you truly want to put your audience before yourself, if you want to, I think as Judas would say, love your audience more than yourself, then you will discipline yourself to never, ever hawk a bad word.
That's article number 3, those last couple of audits, isn't it?
It's actually not.
No.
No, but I like where you're going, so let's go there real quick. So Aristotle argues that there are 3 modes of artistic proof: ethos, pathos, and logos. Logos, however you want to say it, ethos. That's my point now. You want to know the truth of why we're called ethos? I'm going to tell you. So we used to be called purple killer bunnies when it first came out. That was back in 2005. And we wrote a source book. It was the best source book. It's like that big each year. And we emptied all of the LexisNexuses and books. We said no internet sources. Well, 10% internet sources. And we did really well, but mommies didn't like paying $35 for something called purple killer bunnies, which frustrated me. And so we were sitting there one day, we're like, what's the problem here? Well, it's lack of credibility. That's the issue. The name and the artwork. We actually had a bunch of professional artwork done of all these purple killer bunnies. Anyway. And so we're sitting there like, they want something credible? Fine. We'll name it credibility. Ethos. Now it's come to mean much more. So, what he argues in the 3 forms of proof, so this is not necessarily ethics in the sense of having them, and Aristotle does get into the ethics, but not here. The 3 modes of artistic proof. Aristotle's observation is that we all think of every audience and ourselves as rational. And so we try to make rational argumentation. This is what an essay looks like. And if you see a speed and spread debater, you go watch a college debate. Have any of you seen speed and spread debating? Like really fast, like 25 page 1ACs? They practice, actually, debate coaches in that genre. I was a college debate coach for a time. And so my brethren teach breathing techniques so that you can get more words out more quickly within the time limits. It's a pure logos perspective. Aristotle says humans don't work that way. There's more to it. There's ethos, which has 2 primary meanings. First is the credibility of the speaker. And second is credibility of the logic, which you could say the proof. So, you as debaters don't have much credibility. That's okay. Over the course of the year, you gain credibility. At first, you'll be quoting things like, here's what the FDA does. Later in the year, you'll say, well, Title VII actually lays out 115 different sub-departments of agriculture, and inside of Title VII, there are 14 that have to do with specific fruits, watermelons, nuts, and things that the Congress said have to do with interstate commerce, but actually, there's no warrant for that. You just say it, ooh, like that. And it's because you know it. You gain credibility over a season as you know more. But until you have that credibility that flows from you, you gain it through your proof. Key point though, always start over. You have to earn your credibility each time. And so even here today, I'm a student of debate along with you, and you have to become convinced that I actually know what I'm talking about. And I don't think that you have to think that because of my bio or some sort of authority. And a speaker errs when they make that assumption. Instead, a speaker has to assume that each time they have to build up their credibility. Now this one, the most misunderstood of all. What do you all know pathos as? Unfortunately, this one is taught wrongly. Right, passion. Yep.
Feeling.
Passion, feeling, emotion. Somebody's going to say emotion. Yeah. Passion, feeling, and emotion. That is not an inaccurate translation of the word pathos. But that's not what Aristotle means. by pathos. So sometimes someone says a word, and you translate that word, and there are 17 translations, and you chose the wrong one. What Aristotle says, and I love this, is it is putting the audience in the right frame of mind. So, yes, I guess that's emotional, but it doesn't mean be emotional. And that's the mistake that many people make, is, oh, to be a great speaker, I have to have credibility, and I have to get really excited and dramatic. That's nothing to do with that when Aristotle makes this observation. Instead, it's an audience-focused question. How do you get the pathos of the audience in such a state that it's ready to accept? And so you end up with all these questions. If you are presenting something highly controversial to your likely audience, for example, you are about to promote needs of the public over private property rights in a conservative circle. Ding, ding, ding. That's not a very good place to start. So how do you arrange your information to put your audience in the right frame of mind? You probably shouldn't start with your thesis. You should probably start with a story. And in that story, get them to see, just like Jesus does in a parable, get them to see and feel and touch the conflict working out the other way. And then, now that they're hooked, tell them your thesis and your position. So you arrange information differently, but then what I love about Aristotle is he spends 17 chapters going through all the different emotions that people have and dividing them in parts to say under what conditions, circumstances, and what types of people have these different emotions. And so when we talk to you about judge analysis, which we're going to do at some point over the next 48 hours, we'll get into some of those. But the idea is we can't, for example, anger. Anger is an emotion that someone can feel that blocks their ability to hear other things. Aristotle says there are two antidotes to anger. Actually, there are three. But the two primary ones have to do with calmness. And they are, first of all, you can show how the audience would feel if they were on the other side. And so we create a sense of empathy. And the second is that whatever they're angry at, if we can show that that person had something bad happen to them, the person with the anger feels like justice was done. So somebody steals, I don't know, somebody's car, but then gets into an accident and ends up in the hospital, we don't feel as mad about them as stealing the car, like, oh, they got what they deserve. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but that's what Aristotle says, that's how anger works. And so he looks through all these different emotions and how we have to change our audience's condition and frame of mind. So when we're trying to make someone be empathetic, we actually need to answer with anger and so on. That's kind of the study of most of his book, which is really cool. Thank you for launching me on that aside. Any questions about Aristotle's 3 modes of artistic proof?